Okay, welcome to a review of the scientific method. I think this is a topic that is really worth extra study. So the scientific process is something that scientists use to answer questions and conduct their experiments. The one thing I'd like for people to understand, at least from my students, is the scientific process is not exactly linear as it's shown here. In reality, it is a circular process, and scientists usually attack any questions that they may have in a circular sort of pattern. So they can really start anywhere along this line, if you will. But for our purposes, we just have it in a nice order here, so it makes things easier to study when we're first trying to understand what science is really all about. So we're just going to discuss each one of these right now. So the first thing that scientists typically do is they do some research. So they do some research, okay, and based on their research and their previous studies or things that they already know, they use the research to kind of drive a question. And that question is really the reason why scientists conduct their experiments, because they conduct experiments in order to answer questions. Sometimes when they formulate a question, they might do some more research to see if they can maybe make their question a little bit more specific. Okay, so the question now um, is what drives the experiment. Okay, so that drives the experiment. It's the reason why scientists do their work. So, for example, scientists might want to figure out the effect that sugar would have on the mass of laboratory rats. Or scientists might want to figure out what the effect of increasing temperature will have on the ability to exercise. So it's always framed in a question. So, for example, we could ask ourselves, what effect does increasing temperature have on the tendency of a person to exercise? Okay? It's important to note that in our question we're trying to link two things together. Excuse me, we're trying to link cause and effect between two things. After the question, there is what's called the hypothesis. And all the hypothesis is, it's an educated guess. Okay, and the reason why it's called an educated guess is because you're not just going to guess what the answer to your question is willy-nilly, right? You have to base your hypothesis or what you think is going to happen on some sort of information, some background research and knowledge that you have. So an educated guess, you make the guess based on what you've known in the past. So in our sample experiment, we might say, as the temperature increases, the amount of exercise will decrease. So if, it can also be stated as an if-then statement. Okay, we went over this in class, if-then statement. So if the temperature increases, okay, that's one variable, then the amount of exercise will decrease. Okay, so notice that we're always linking two variables together. And to be more specific, if you want to write it as an if-then statement, you can write it as if, and then this next variable is usually the manipulated variable. Okay, in other words, that's the variable that the experimenter can manipulates. The experimenter sort of mucks around with to see what effect it has. So if I change the manipulated variable, then I will see some change in the responding variable. Okay? Oops, not spelling that right. Responding. Okay? And after you get your hypothesis, you come up with a procedure. So what is going to be your procedure? Basically, that's what you do to try testing your hypothesis. So the procedure is the steps that you do it. Afterwards, you then do it. And then you make your observations. Okay? And observations is strictly that. All you're doing is reporting what you see, what you hear, what you might smell, anything to do with your senses, you report. And that's strictly what it is. You don't do any analysis in your observations. Okay? Your observation is strictly just that, just observing. You're not interpreting anything. In your analysis, you try to construct some meaning to it. Okay, so an analysis just takes the observations from your experiment and tries to come up with some explanation as to why that happened. And the conclusion, the main part of the conclusion is whether or not your hypothesis is true. Oops. So that's just not written very well. Sorry. Is your hypothesis true? That's what you're trying to answer. Okay? So you would state in your conclusion, yes, the experimental results clearly indicate that as the temperature goes up, the amount of exercise decreases, and so on and so forth. If your hypothesis is not supported, then you would say the hypothesis is not supported, and you would change your hypothesis and say, okay, this is what's proven. Also, what can go in your conclusion is anything that you might think could benefit, or could make your experiment better. Any real-world applications. I know we talked about the analysis as well, but your conclusion is just. But the main thing is this: is your hypothesis true? Okay. When you communicate, that means you got to publish your results. Okay, and scientists like to publish their results, and that just takes their information that they've done and releases it out to the world so that other scientists can see what they've done and hopefully replicate their same results. It's an important part because if another scientist conducts the experiment or reads over the experiment, they can scrutinize. Okay, in other words, they can criticize the last scientist's procedure and maybe make it better. Okay, and the reason why that's so important is because if something is repeated over and over and over again, then it's given more power. If more than one scientist concludes that the original scientist's procedure wasn't very valid, then people will question their results. So that's why it's important to communicate your results. Variables, very important. Okay, so your variables are very, very important. There are three variables that we need to worry about. The first is called the independent variable. It's also called the manipulated variable. And when we graph it, it's always on the x-axis. Okay. And the manipulated variable is just look at the name, manipulated, right? So when you manipulate something, that means you are actually physically doing something to it. Okay, so if I'm a juggler, right, I'm going to manipulate juggling instruments or whatever it is, right? So if you make that connection, then this is what the experimenter, okay, this is what the experimenter will directly effect. Okay, so the experimenter will directly affect it somehow. So for example, if we wanted to investigate the rate of exercise as a response to increase in temperature, well, the experimenter would increase the temperature. That's the manipulated variable. The dependent variable, also called the responding variable, which is found on the y-axis of a graph, is just that. Look at the word responding, okay? So it is what's going to happen as a response to a change in the manipulated variable, okay? So this is what changes by way of the experiment. This is what the experimenter is going to be looking for, okay? And it's called dependent variable because what you observe in this variable depends on the independent variable. Okay, that's why it's called a dependent variable. It's very important that you get these two set, that you understand what these are. The controlled variable is, you have to ask yourself, what are some other things that could cause a similar response that I anticipate in the responding variable from changing the manipulated variable? All of those things you need to hold constant. Okay? So for example, in our exercise example, we might say that if any athlete has a better pair of shoe than another athlete, well, that could increase or decrease, that will definitely affect the the amount of exercise. That will affect the dependent variable. Therefore, we must ensure that all the athletes wear the same pair of shoes, okay, given their size, etc. Does that should make sense? So anything that can affect the responding variable besides the manipulated variable has to be held constant or the same throughout all the trials. Okay? Otherwise, you can't make a connection between the independent variable and the dependent variable, which is the goal of the scientific process. Okay, now I want to talk about graphing. I took a little, just kind of a made-up example here, and all it is, I made up an example where there's a business here, and certain businesses are selling, I don't know, Slurpees, let's say. Okay, so it's a 7-Eleven or a Mac store, a convenience store, and we're selling Slurpees. And what we're doing is we're drawing in customers. Perhaps we have a deal where if you buy a Slurpee, you get a chocolate bar for half off or whatever it is. So what we're doing by setting that up, we are controlling the number of customers. Okay? So we are drawing in customers. That's the manipulated variable. And where you find the manipulated variable on a graph? It's right there on the x-axis. The x-axis is the horizontal axis. So the customers are going to come in, they're going to take advantage of the special, and they're going to spend money. And our responding variable would be how much money we make. That's not something that we control exactly. We just have to put it out there and see what happens and see if we can get the customers to come in, and more customers come in, we make more money. So, and then we just graph it. So we graph the, the independent variable versus the responding variable, and we make a title like this. Number of customers versus profit, for example. So it's the independent variable versus the responding variable. You could come up with something else that's creative, and that's totally fine. You could say something like, I don't know, the amount of money made based on the number of customers in store. Okay, and this easily shows that as the number of customers increases, so as we go from here to here, the number of customers increases, well, the amount of money that we make will also increase. Okay, we've established the connection, and we showed it pictorially by a picture between our independent or manipulated variable and our responding variable or our dependent variable on the x and y axis respectively. Okay, so here we're going to go through a sample experiment and identify all the parts of the scientific method, identify the variables, and what we think the graph would look like. So here's an experiment actually inspired by one of my students this term, and here it is. So two experimenters wanted to determine what effect adding salt would have on how easily water freezes. They believed that adding salt to water would not impact the freezing level. Okay, so right here we can identify easily, this is the question. Even though it's not phrased as a question, oops, it is the question. So we can rephrase that as a question by saying, what is the effect that salt will have on how quickly water freezes? That's our question. The next statement, they believe that adding salt to water would not impact the freezing level. Can you guys guess what that is? Okay, if you said hypothesis, that is correct. That's an educated guess. And then it goes on. They added 125 milliliters of water to two separate equally sized plastic containers. 5 grams of salt was added to one of the containers. Both containers were placed in the same freezer at exactly the same time. The experimenters took the temperature and determined it to be 8 degrees. In half-hour intervals, they checked the status of each container for the exact same time of 10 seconds. Temperature was taken every time it was found to be 8 degrees. They recorded the time on the chart. So that is your observation. So this whole thing here is your observations. Okay, I'll just abbreviate that. Oh, I'll write out the whole thing. Observations. Okay. Nope, sorry, that is not observations. My mistake. That is that's your procedure. Okay, so that's your procedure there. Okay, instead of where I said observations, that's your procedure. Oopsie, my mistake. Okay, procedure. Now, here where it says they observed, well, there's a key word for you. Again, when you're reading these kind of questions, or any kind of question, look for keywords. So they observed that the containers both froze and recorded the observations for every time they checked the freezer. In the end, they determined that the container of water with salt took 3.5 hours to freeze, while the container with water, with just water, took 1.5 hours to freeze. There's your observations. Okay, they analyzed the data and determined that the salt must have slowed the freezing process. That's your analysis. That's trying to link your observations to some sort of explanation. They concluded that their original hypothesis was not supported and changed their hypothesis to fit with their experimenters' results. Therefore, it is concluded, this is what should also be added, therefore it is concluded as a result of this experiment that adding salt to water will increase the amount of time that it takes for water to freeze compared to a similar or exact amount of water to freeze. Okay? So what are the variables? So let's talk about this. So again, my first variable that I want to identify is the manipulated variable or the independent variable. Okay? Independent variable. Okay, sorry for my writing. So the manipulated variable, if I go back to my experiment, I see, okay, what is the experimenter adding? What is the experimenter doing to this experiment? And he's adding, or he or she is adding 5 grams of salt to one and not adding salt to another. Therefore, the independent variable is the amount of salt, whether you're adding it or not. The second we're looking at is the responding variable, okay, or our dependent variable. Dependent variable. All right. So what depends on adding salt? What are we trying to detect? What are we trying to measure? Okay, and that is the time it takes to freeze the water. Oops, oh no, I pushed the button. Oh no, I pushed the button. Oh boy. To freeze the water. Okay? So that's what we're measuring. That's manipulated, that's responding, and control is a little bit tricky. So our controlled variable, we have to ask ourselves, what can also affect whether something freezes or not? So we have to come up with at least, I challenge you to come up with at least 3. 2 to 3. Okay, so 1 definitely is the amount of water. Okay, we would suspect that the more water there is, the longer it would take to freeze. So we have to make sure that the amount of water is the same, and we did that. We kept it at 125 milliliters. Okay. Also, perhaps what the containers are made of. So the containers have to be the same size, and they have to be made up of the same material. Okay, that might have an impact. So right there, we've actually identified 3. So the amount of water, the container, the material that it's made out of, and the size of it. Okay, and the other one, if you noticed, is the amount of time taken to verify the cups, to examine the cups, right? And we made that constant, 10 seconds for every trial. So those are our controlled variables. Okay, I really hope that this helped you guys sort of understand the manipulated, responding, control variable as well as the scientific method, because it's actually pretty important stuff. Thanks.